Welcome to the Tudor Dixon Podcast. Today we have Lindsey Boylan with us. She is the first woman to publicly accuse New York Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo of sexual harassment. You might remember this is like the Emmy award-winning governor, because why would you get an Emmy for talking about COVID and things that you do as a governor? But I think that that's important to mention, because that just goes to show how much power he had. He had the entire Hollywood establishment behind him. He still does. And that's why it's important to have these conversations about powerful people that take advantage of their position, and why that should be really disqualifying for future public office. I mean, this is a guy who had to step away because of what he had done. And yet here he is now. For those of you who don't know, Andrew Cuomo has announced that he is going to run for mayor of New York City. And I think that's very devastating to the people who have been hurt by him. And so I'm grateful to Lindsey for joining me today. Lindsey, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
It's, I think it's something that a lot of women deal with. I remember when Carly Fiorina was running for president and someone asked her about harassment, and she said, every woman who has been in business has experienced it. And I think a lot of people in the country went, no. But I think it's true.
It is true. Yeah. I mean, I worked in the public sector, private sector, and, municipal finance after business school. And I like to say, I don't like to say, but I say that each of us women knows sexual harassment. I have had some version of sexual harassment in every job I've had, but it was never as pervasive and had the entire system set up to be predatory towards the women who worked for him as when I worked for Andrew Cuomo. So it was just of a magnitude that I can't even fully explain.
That to me is the scary thing. I think it's different. I had experienced it in manufacturing, and I have said before, I worked at a family company, and one of the guys that I worked with on a business trip was very inappropriate. And my dad was the owner of the company, and I came back and I explained to him, and they were friends. And at the time, I was really kind of ticked, because my dad's reaction was, you're going to deal with your whole life, so go in and deal with it. And I was like, wow, that's such a jerk thing. But it actually empowered me in a way I would never have expected, because I then faced him myself and went in and said, hey, this, and this, not okay. We're never going to do this again. And that's awesome. I was in a kind of a power position, because obviously my dad owned the company. But for women who are not, I mean, the political scene is a totally different scene when you have somebody, because there's no boss to go to, No.
And I will say, I'm a Democrat. I was working for probably the most powerful Democrat at the time, not just in the state of New York, but in the country, because of all these, Emmy awards and the plaudits that he'd received and the self-promotion he had done during COVID. For as much as the Democratic Party likes to say that they support women, this was a great example to the contrary. And I was working for this really powerful man, and I was not a junior person, actually. I was very senior, and I could be asked to lead the state's recovery work in Puerto Rico at any given moment, which is something I did. Or I could be sexually harassed, and his entire senior staff, predominantly of women, at least in his office work, participated in that. I like to say that, I don't like to say, but I felt like, when you have a snake and they eat mice and maybe kind of in a vicious way, someone hits the mouse against the tank to kind of disorient it so the snake can eat it. That is what it felt like working for Andrew Cuomo. And I think it's really important to say we cannot be partisan about this issue. There's bad guys in power are bad for all of us, and it doesn't matter if they're in your party or they're not. And I think that is why it ultimately resonated, was because these are all these women. And by the way, I'm the old lady of the crew. I also have the most privilege of a platform to speak up. So there's lots of women much younger than myself who he's harassed continuously, even through the court system, requesting gynecological records. Another victim of his, yes, a young victim, younger than I think 2 of his 3 daughters, at least. He sought gynecological records from her simply because she accused him and provided significant evidence that he harassed her. In another case one of the women who came forward was a state trooper, a woman whose job it was to protect him with her life, and he sexually harassed her. So much for a guy who purports to be a law enforcement politician, especially right now. He's trying to lean into that. What kind of law enforcement politician sexually harasses a person whose job it is to protect him with her life? And it's so beyond. When the physical harassment stopped and he resigned and he, for one day, said he understood to a certain extent that he was in the wrong, he's proceeded to spend the next several years harassing all of us, whether or not we're suing him. I am not, because I don't want to have anything to deal with this gross man. He's proceeded to attack us all in court on the taxpayer's dime. And I think the state comptroller put out a figure this week saying between the sexual harassment cases, the faulty book deal on COVID, he spent $60 million of state money defending himself. And none of us have that money to defend ourselves from him and his attacks of us, even though he's the one who abused us to begin with. So it's beyond disgusting. And I think
you're exposing something that I don't think that a lot of people understand. And this is why you've heard rumblings, and you've probably heard this too, rumblings of this congressional slush fund that was used for years to cover up things like this.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yes.
that is not, and sadly, a bipartisan slush fund,
Yeah,
because this is not a partisan issue. This is a scumbag issue, and you can be a scumbag in any party.
Exactly.
And this goes from, we've heard stories anywhere from kids, like some of the young pages that were abused by men and women in Congress, and these are powerful people, but again, using taxpayer money to get out of committing a crime, which to me is shocking that this is allowed. And then you told me something before we got on that is even more shocking to me. He was allowed to use the taxpayer money, but now you're having to defend yourself against him, even though you're not even going after him.
Yeah, I'm not suing him. I don't want anything to do with that man. I don't want to interact with him ever again. I don't want anything from him, including what people often say of women who come forward is that we want money. Well, I've paid $1.5 million personally in legal fees for court cases that I'm not involved in, that I would be surprised if that man has $100 in his bank account. I don't want anything from him. I just want him to disappear. And I think I just want to point that out, because so often women are smeared, oh, she wants money. It's a ridiculous notion. And the women who are suing him really just want him to be accountable and want the harm to stop. And somehow there's this public officers law on the state books that enables him to continue to draw from state coffers and New York taxpayer money for these defenses. I think the leadership in the state Senate has put some legislation forth to stop that or kind of curb that. But as you point out with, even in Congress, it's an equal opportunity self-protection situation. And that's what a lot of these pieces of legislation are, to protect them. And even though I was a high-ranking official, high enough certainly to benefit from taxpayer-funded defense, because I was the one harassed, because I was the victim here, I can't avail myself of that. So it's just it's to an extreme that I think people can't even really consciously understand, because you would never think that a man who abused so many people, women, nursing home seniors indirectly with his policies, would be availing himself of $60 million in taxpayer money. And in fact, the lead lawyer on this case for him, who's getting most of the money, is co-hosting a fundraiser for his mayoral candidacy tomorrow in Manhattan.
You cannot make it up.
You cannot make it up. And she also appeared, Rita Glavin, she appeared at one of his announcements when he launched his campaign. And she answered the question about the money and the seeking gynecological records. His taxpayer-funded attorney shows up at his political campaign press conference and defends him as part of his campaign. And she goes on to basically smear the victim again that he sought gynecological records for. And listen, I would love if people felt, compelled by seeing me and saying, that's not right, it shouldn't have happened to her, and felt bad. But think about women, predominantly. A majority of these women are significantly younger than I am. I'm the old lady of the group. He was being a predator with these young women, mostly in either one of their first jobs out of college, in an executive assistant role. And he was taking advantage of that power structure. In my own way, it was really humiliating because I worked my whole career to get into these powerful rooms, and to have someone treating me poorly like this, sometimes I didn't even want to talk about it because it humiliated me in a way.
And like you say, you were senior staff, so
Yes.
you had worked to a point. It wasn't like you, I mean, and not that it would have made any difference, but the point is you were at a level where you had obviously had the experience. This is your reputation on the line if you come
Yes.
out against someone. And I think that's why so often women and even other people in the office are afraid to speak out, because
Yes.
this is a person who can fire you at will. They can
Yes.
get rid of you. They can destroy your career. And the career, the political career is very much based on reputation
Yes.
and word of mouth.
And
so
what did he do? He originally, who did he use? He reached out to the Time's Up organization that was literally built out of sexual harassment in the Me Too movement. And he tried to get them to sign. He told them not to support me publicly, which they had been considering doing when I came forward. And then he tried to get them, I believe, to sign on to a letter smearing me, which they didn't do. But ultimately, their entire organization blew up because they did indirectly support him against someone who he victimized. And I just think it shows the hypocrisy even of my own party. And if it takes highlighting the hypocrisy of my own party, I don't care. The whole point of being in these jobs is to help people. And instead, what we have with people like Andrew Cuomo, and probably many people you've dealt with in your career, is people who are in a self-protection industry, not a help people industry.
That's such a great way of putting
everything.
Because their boss is the taxpayer and the voter, and the voter doesn't always hear about this. And the voter, and especially if you control the media, which, to be honest, folks in your party have a lot more control over the media than even on the Republican side. So if you control the narrative, you have all the power. And so I know I read some of the articles where you've said, even internally, I say to myself, why did I stay as long as I did? But I think that for folks who read this, because I'm sure you've been asked that question, why didn't you just leave? For folks who are reading this, it sounds like a big industry. It is a small industry. That is a big job to have in a small industry. And for you to walk away, that is incredibly damaging to your career. And this is the position women are put in. What do I do?
Yeah. I mean, I like to say that, if you want to be in politics, you're a Democrat, you live in New York, this was the Olympics. So for me to leave that, it's like saying, I don't want to go to the Olympics. And I worked so hard. You listen, politicians, for the most part, unless they're doing something I'm not sure I'm a fan of, don't get paid a ton of money for it. So they do it because hopefully they believe in what they're doing.
Exactly.
And that is how I felt about it. I mean, now I'm lucky to have a husband who hates politics. Not lucky that he hates politics, but he's not in this field, which is good. So, we're okay, and I'm able to mount a defense, but I didn't join this industry to benefit financially. I spent years in government and going up that ladder because I believe in it. And I believe there's something that we need to do to help people every day. And we can disagree on the policy of that. But for a guy to make all the women who work for him uncomfortable, to create an entire toxic environment that feeds him as the predator, to use government funds this way, to smear me when he was still the sitting governor with his taxpayer-funded attorney on his campaign conference line for his reelection for governor, to use the entire New York press corps, particularly the Albany press corps. And you mentioned media, and I do think it's important, is this whole thing that I'm sure you've seen in your career, this access journalism piece, is really disgusting, because I know if a certain person, particularly who's been based in Albany for most of their career in politics, is going to cover a story, then it's going to be at the very least watered down. And they're probably going to just cover press releases from this candidate, not because they love him, but because they know how the system works. And that is all part of this corruption. And, I know this is a dangerous, difficult time for journalists, but I expect a lot better than some of what I'm seeing. And people who have covered this man, listen, the journalists know exactly who this man. He was clipped on one interview saying to a female journalist something to the effect of, "Do you like big sausage sandwiches?" Just disgusting, innuendo, sexual innuendo. He's like a 3-year-old. like when he asked me to play strip poker on the plane. But he's truly disgusting, and journalists know that. And I think one of the things that will always stand out in my mind that I did say in the deposition was I'll never forget being in the vehicle with him, and there's always like state troopers guarding him, and he's reaming a very well-known journalist on the phone, absolutely yelling at him. And I didn't know who it was. I'm like, gosh, that must be one of our staffers who he's yelling at. And it was a famous journalist. And I just said to me, and that was when I was still working for him. So if my colleagues aren't going to stand up for me, the state troopers are set up to protect him. All this system is set up to protect him. And then journalists are afraid of him. How is anyone going to get this word out? So I didn't think there was a lot of benefit. The only reason I ended up saying something publicly was because I talked about it being a toxic environment. And then one of the young women, much younger than myself, the one he sought gynecological records for, reached out to me and DM'd me and said, I don't know you, but thank you for saying something critical about this man. He sexually harassed me. And her story mirrored mine. She kind of looks a little bit like me, disgustingly. He has a type. And I believed her. And then like the next day or so, you've spent your career in politics. He was being floated for a potential attorney general pick for, a Biden administration. And I knew what that meant. That meant they were putting the balloon out there to see if anyone was going to push back. And so and
that's the top law enforcement officer of the country.
Be the top law enforcement officer over every woman I love, over my daughter, over every woman you care about. And that just did me in. And I don't necessarily think I didn't really think about the implications, because if I did, maybe I would have been like, that's crazy, Lindsey, to do this.
But I also think if you think about this everybody says that Donald Trump is such a showman, but this is a political game that people play, is how can I make the show look good for me? And if you think about that time period, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but like me thinking back, he is also around that time, he was also being floated as a presidential candidate, and people were talking about he was the sexiest man alive. And there were all these people putting these weird videos out. We're talking. And I remember being like, barf, why do people think this guy is so sexy? But you have to kind of think, was this something that his people were pushing out there? Because that's what they do.
That's what they do. He forces, it's such a great symbol of who this man is. He forces himself on people. He forces himself on New Yorkers. He forces himself on the media. And even in the, leaking that his people did about him running for mayor, he was saying it was this kind of community driven, draft Andrew Cuomo. Well, Carl McCall and the New York, and everyone printed the first story where Carl McCall, who was the head of SUNY Poly, famously they had been, competing in an early run for governor years before that. Carl McCall drafted him. No, that's total BS. It's total theatrics. Carl McCall was appointed by Andrew Cuomo and firmly in his circle and doing what he was told for years. And anyone who worked for Andrew Cuomo knew that. And I just say that one example because everything you see that he puts out there is entirely creation, usually a lie. I mean, one thing that is a minor story that I like to share because it just shows what a sociopath he is he was doing some, I don't know if it was an interview or a Q&A or a gaggle with the press after an event we had. And I was one of the staffers with him at this event. So it must have been like an economic development thing, which is what I oversaw for the state. And somehow he either said or he responded to a journalist where he said he told some story about him fishing and getting a bald eagle feather. And then he and, interestingly enough, Rich as a party were talking about this afterwards. It was a totally made up story because it came out that you're not supposed to keep, I think, a bald eagle feather. He had completely made up the story. So it was Rich as a party, this little troll who is working for him now, job to try and find some way to, walk back that bullshit, excuse my language, walk back that story entirely. And I'm just like, what kind of sociopath makes up a minor, an innocuous story about a bald eagle feather? It was just so bizarre. And that's what he is.
That's the thing. It's like, if you're willing to make up a story about something that doesn't matter at all, that doesn't need to be made up, then what else are you willing to do? And I think that is where the American people have been so blinded by what actually happens in politics. I mean, even if you watch some of the shows of behind the scenes, you get a glimpse into the deals and the obsession with power. And I think, you mentioned that you imagine these people don't go into it for money. They go into it for the right reasons because there's not a lot of money.
Well, I
but
think
there
he went
actually
into
is
it
a
for-
lot
for-
of
for
power.
I think he and people like him went into it because they want to be the center of the universe and they like
Yes.
power.
Yes.
To be clear, nothing that I've ever experienced of him, with him, or around him ever makes me think he has any moral compass or any actual passion to help people. I truly think he is a sociopath. So I do think the majority of people go in it to help. I think he went into it because it was the family business and it was a way for him to continue amassing power. And he knew how to do it by bullying people.
Well, and I know that you have bonded with Janice Dean over her own
She's one of my best
situation.
friends.
She is awesome.
She's amazing. I
That
love
woman
Janice.
is such a fighter. And I think that people overlook her concern because they go, oh, you know what? COVID was a tragedy. So many people
So
ended
offensive.
up losing people. But I think we're in somewhat of a similar situation. I was here in Michigan, you guys in New York. The governors both put COVID positive patients into nursing
Yes.
homes. Cuomo even stopped the practice before Whitmer did. But I also lost my grandmother in the nursing
I didn't know
home.
that. I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
And I think back about it, and I think that we were complacent at the time because we were all, panicked and we
was
didn't
scary.
have the information.
Yeah.
We didn't have the information that the governors had. The other governors didn't do this. And Janice's complaint is valid because
is.
they had information we didn't have. And I look back at right before when we were saying goodbye to my grandmother, standing at the window of her nursing home, looking down the row and seeing other families standing at the windows. And I look back on that and I think these people had information that and when you say he didn't care, I mean, that's how that happens,
Yes. And I think now there is such a desire to not hold people like my governor, at least in my case, is the case I know very familiar with, accountable, because Democratic leaders think that it'll make them look bad. So there's so much selfishness here. I followed, not just because I love Janice and because I care about this tremendous wrong that happened to so many families like yours. But I wanted to see what he was going to do with this interview on the select committee on COVID. And I was surprised that the Democrats said anything critical. That shows the extent to which he did things really wrong, forcing the nursing homes to accept these people, lying about the numbers of dead related to the nursing home policy, and lying about his personal awareness of this policy, and lying about the extent to which he knew the number of differentials. I mean, as you probably know, he's been referred for criminal prosecution by the House Select Committee. And I think it's just kind of funny because we are where we are in New York City to some extent, because there is a concern amongst several people that Eric Adams cannot be an effective independent leader. Policy aside, that he cannot make decisions for the city as a whole because he's more concerned about his own personal, potential issues with the Department of Justice and the like.
So how is that different?
Exactly. That's what I really want to drive. One of the things I really want to drive home is, if you think that is a problem, some Turkish flights, maybe some upgrades, I'm not diminishing these things. What do you think is going to happen with the mayor of New York City, who has been found by the Biden DOJ to have harassed 13 women who worked for him and created a sexually toxic environment? A mayor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, if he were to win, which I don't think he's going to because we're going to fight against it, but who has been referred for criminal prosecution and for lying to Congress. So what do you think is going to happen with a man who has all of these outstanding judicial issues at the federal level? And what do you think is going to happen there? You think you're going to have a more independent leader than the guy who has some problems with campaign finance?
And these are all things that reflect on his leadership. Like he's a known quantity. And I think that's the thing that frustrates women, is like when you have the receipts. This guy is a known quantity. He did this in
Yes.
office. And not only did he do things personally that were
Yes.
wrong, but professionally also that were wrong.
Yes.
He handled situations inappropriately as governor. How could
Yes.
you possibly hand him another elected position? But there is power in that name. And that is
Yes.
the scary thing, is how manipulative that can be
Yes.
on both sides, how manipulative
Yes.
these commercials are and the attacks on the other side. And yet the media is not coming out like you think they would and saying,
Yes.
dude, come on, you got it.
Yes.
You're done.
There's a little too much stenography right now. And I one thing that, people ask about polls, like, what do you make of the few polls that have been put out that put him ahead? Well, best I can tell, aside from the recent Quinnipiac poll, they were all polls put out either by his campaign, people related to him, or another campaign that benefits from painting him as the big bad wolf to beat. So I think that's totally irrelevant. The Quinnipiac piece, basically, if someone has 100% name recognition, and all they have on the outset, when they're the only one with that name recognition, they only have 30% support. That's not a good number. And in a ranked choice voting system, which is still new for us in New York, we're still trying to understand it. The objective that I have and that others like me have is, one, make sure everyone does not rank him because he's a monster. And
I was watching some of your videos, and for those of us who are not, I was like, okay, wait, how does this exactly work? So do you have to rank 5 because it could go to 5, or how does that work?
Yes. And I try to explain it because this is only our second mayoral election we've had ranked choice voting, and it is a little bit different. And I also think that polling, even if it were completely independent, doesn't factor in ranked choice voting at all. So at the primary level, in this case, the Democratic primary, because I'm Democrat, and we're talking about Andrew Cuomo, when people show up on the day of to vote, or they do early voting, they're going to be presented with 5 slots to fill for the mayor's position. And, we're telling everyone, I think, I just saw a letter come out this morning from over 150 Democratic elected leaders, committee members in the city, not to rank him. So that's the first objective, is to not rank him as one of these 5. But then also, and I'll explain why, people need to fill out all 5 of those slots in a ranked choice voting system, particularly because there are so many candidates. And for those who are not in New York or not familiar, Eric Adams won, the current mayor, and won in the first ranked choice voting process in one of the very late rounds. And he only won by a few thousand. So we almost had a different mayor. And when I say different rounds, to simplify what happens is, let's say you put your 5 candidates on there, and your first candidate is the lowest, gets the lowest votes in the first round of ranked choice vote counting. They're out. So then they go to all the people who put that person who's out on first on their ballot, and they see who their next first person is. And so all of these things accumulate, and we need people to fill out all 5 positions. So, some might say, Lindsey, I only like Brad, or I only like Zellner, or a different candidate. I'm only going to fill them out. It's really important that people fill out all 5, because if you don't, and let's say your 2 candidates that you list, they're out immediately, your vote ends up not counting for mayor. You don't end up having to say for mayor. So it is a complicated system. I do also think that is in no way reflected in polling right now. But it's going to be interesting.
That would be really hard to poll for.
Yes. Yeah, you can. And I will tell you this, this letter that I mentioned to you was signed by, as I said, almost 200 individual leaders, political clubs in the city. That's a big deal, to just have a letter entirely signed about anti-Cuomo. And I would say the top, the 5 candidates that I have thus far given public matching funds to, because I want someone to beat him that I am willing to have as mayor. All of those 5 appear to be willing to coordinate with other campaigns. And they're all saying, don't rank Andrew Cuomo to a certain extent. And they're all saying, rank 5 people and put us first. And then you could put these other people first. So I would suspect, as the primary goes on, you will not only continue to see this anti-Cuomo message, but a big part of that is going to be the candidates themselves saying anti-Cuomo and saying rank all 5. And, maybe you will see two candidates who are particularly aligned, do a lot more together and the like. And that's how he's going to be beat.
So how many candidates are there?
It is a lot. I don't know it, to a certain extent, unless it's a really wealthy, like Bloomberg-esque individual, which we don't have in this race. I really go by who will receive public matching funds. It's an 8-to-1 match. And I think this Thursday is the next filing deadline. So, as I said, I've donated to 5 candidates. I have 5 on my list that I think would be good mayors and are viable in terms of the potential support. So that's what I'm focused on, but there are more than 5.
Wow. Well, we are definitely going to be watching, and we'll continue to spread the news, because I obviously want to support women. And
thank you.
As I said, I've experienced this. And for those of you listening, if you don't know what it's like to be in an office like this, talk to women in your life. I promise you, they've experienced it, and they will, if they listen to this podcast, they'll go, yeah, that's the conundrum. And also it's frustrating to me, because that this happens we hear about it in DC all the time.
Yes.
And I would also encourage people who are elected, when they see other elected people, call it out, because you have the power. It's different for someone outside of the staff to go, hey, knock it off.
Yeah.
And that's meaningful to every woman out there that's trying to actually make something of her career. And it's so unfair to have your life's work robbed from you because someone in power has that ability.
And by the way, if it's a notorious predator like Andrew Cuomo, everyone around him knows it. So everyone who was in a senior, elected position in Albany, they all knew this. I mean, unfortunately, before I went to work for the state and the governor, and maybe this will be the last thing I share, it's just very chilling. There's an organization called ABNY, an Association for Better New York, and it brings together, business leaders, real estate leaders, political leaders in the city. And the woman who was the head of it at the time, I knew and I was friendly with. And when I got the job my first job working for the state, not directly for him, she said, be careful, stay away from the governor. He has a women problem. And I just had to kill a story in the New York Times about him and women. And I didn't at the time focus on it because I wasn't going to go work for him directly. It ended up that I was slowly brought into his, fish tank. And unfortunately, all the bad things happened to me. But this man's abuse of women in particular, and his abuse in general, is an open story in any powerful New York circle that you know. And that is what truly disgusts me to your.
Well, thank you so much for coming out and sharing. I know this is hard, and I appreciate it. Lindsey Boylan, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you. And I appreciate your time. We need to get the word out, and I appreciate it.
I agree. And thank you all for joining us on the Tudor Dixon Podcast. As always, for this episode and others, go to TudorDixonPodcast.com, the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And join us next time on the Tudor Dixon Podcast. Have a blessed day.